Simple Support friends. I'm Angie Gunn, and I'm a sex therapist in Portland, Oregon, and I've been working with the sex worker population for about 5 years now and have experience in the community and also a relationship to the work. And I'm really grateful to be here with you today and to talk a little bit about emotional trauma and the ways in which emotional abuse impacts our well-being. And the title of my little seminar here is Unpacking Emotional Abuse Dynamics and a Path to Healing. It's a little bit of a short time frame, so I'm going to do my best to pack a lot in and give you all the information that I can in a short amount of time. So I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. So feel free to write them down and we'll have a discussion forum that you can post them in later. My goal today is to help you to focus on how to support strengthening your personal well-being, your presence, your identity, and business sustainability, and managing the ways in which emotional abuse dynamics play into all those facets of your life. One of the key things to think about when you think about emotional abuse compared to other types of abuse is it's the ways in which folks will use our thoughts, our feelings, our views of ourselves, particularly the stories or the meanings that we give to things, and use those against us. This often plays out in the form of coercion, manipulation, targeting specific identity characteristics, such as being a sex worker, such as feeling disempowered around certain identities that you hold, using language, nonverbal cues, as well as policies and systems to oppress and coerce. And so what we're really trying to do is make explicit and clear the things that are sometimes subtle, things that are like, you have that thought in your mind, like, is this abusive behavior? Is this person treating me like shit? Or is there something else happening here, right? So we want to help unpack a little bit about what that can manifest as well as talk a little bit about the ways in which you can take back power, you can find integration within yourself, and find strategies to manage the traumatic impact of that abuse. I'm going to show a couple of images to kind of help with the conversation. So first we want to talk a little bit about what is coercive control and how does that manifest. So this is some definitions of what emotional or psychological abuse can look like. One of the things I want to point out in terms of specifically your work is that a lot of folks engage in emotionally abusive behavior beyond just romantic relationships. So you may be very familiar with intimate partner violence or domestic violence, but we want to talk about that impact when it comes to clients you might work with, when it comes to bosses or colleagues, when it comes to people in the community, and how to be assertive and clear about your boundaries and how you deserve to be treated. Because regardless of your work, regardless of the type of sex work you do, the population, the community, the space, you deserve to be treated with care and respect. You deserve to have access to your power, to your ability to have your voice, and your ability to be treated as a whole person, regardless of your work. And also, maybe because of your work, that you get to be seen with more care and respect. So a few ways this plays out, psychological or mental abuse, there's this category, which is manipulation, minimization, denial, lies. So basically like using your own thoughts or feelings against you, as we just said. This can play out in terms of control of your money, which we know is a huge deal. Clients withholding money, bosses or producers withholding money, pimps withholding money, lots of ways in which they use that as a tool to manipulate and coerce, which is abusive behavior. Stalking, surveilling, possessing, controlling any kind of access that you may have, access to your basic needs, access to transportation. And this relates to control of money, which is abusive behavior. Using any kind of cruelty, threats, intimidation. Basically, if you have a gut instinct that someone's being manipulative, someone's being coercive, it's probably true. And I really want to help support you in how do you navigate listening to your body, listening to what it's telling you when you have that moment of, I'm feeling disempowered. I'm feeling like someone is trying to take this thing from me and it's not okay. You have the right and you deserve the space to assert that. And to the extent that you can, do so safely, limiting relationships and any kind of violence. And I'll make sure that folks have this PowerPoint so you can come back and look at this slide more. One of the ways that it's important to talk about emotional abuse is considering the facts that certain identities are more likely to be abused. And this plays into the idea of intersectionality, which I think you have another webinar on, so I'm not going to go too much into detail. But when you think about the ways in which you as an individual have multiple identities that relate to how you function in the world, your race, your identity, your culture, your history, your age, your orientation, your gender identity, all these factors can sometimes make it more likely that someone will be abusive towards you, partially because when you have multiple intersecting identities, you are in a disempowered position because the dominant culture or the dominant class has been socialized, has used a lot of their power in the past to take advantage. And so you're fighting an uphill battle when it comes to intersecting identities and the ways in which that plays out. And here's a little chart that shows that a little bit better. So you can think about the ways in which all types of oppression is connected. All oppression relates to one another and has a similar impact. So you think about the ways in which racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, etc., may impact how someone would treat a sex worker who also has those identities. And I want to really honor those of you listening who struggle with just being, finding the space to be considered a whole, beautiful, strong, empowered, worthy of respect human. You do, and we're here to support you in finding space to do that. So regardless of your identities, we know that it's hard, and we know that it's harder when you have multiple intersecting identities. But that does not mean that that treatment is okay. It does not mean that it should be perpetuated. And we have a obligation as a community and as a sex work support organization, as well as professionals that work in the field, to continue to do advocacy and activism, specifically for those folks who are more marginalized relative to identities. So when you think about the ways that someone could use your thoughts and your feelings against you, it's really helpful to think about the ways in which we are really sensitive to other humans. We are perpetually seeking to join, to understand, to collaborate, to connect, to belong. The minute our workplace security, our security in a family, our security in a relationship is feeling threatened, we tend to accommodate, to subvert, to subjugate our own well-being, our own identities in order to have that connection. And it may be financial, it may be out of fear of needing those people in our lives, but there's lots of reasons why we will subvert our well-being, especially when it's maybe not physically and overt. You know, someone's not beating me, but someone's being really coercive and controlling. And is that okay? It's not okay, but we understand why it happens, and it's a lot of survival-oriented instincts. You're needing to engage in those relationships, in those experiences, because it helps you survive. And sometimes it's hard to understand the ways in which trauma patterns play out in our lives, because they are so survival-oriented, and often they don't really serve us, right? Subjugating our well-being isn't going to help us long-term, but in that moment, the preservation of that relationship feels like survival, feels like the only path that we have, feels like I can't see myself outside of this paradigm, this box, this person, this connection. I don't have another strategy for where to live, for who's going to keep track of me, who has an awareness of what's happening in my life, in my world. We desperately need to find ways to belong and fit and to connect and to stay safe in relationships and in business relationships and in communities. And so finding communities where you get to be your whole self, where you get to be fully in your power, finding businesses, jobs, partnerships, where you get to be fully seen, have your voice, have your ability to assert your boundaries, is really, really transformative, but also really hard to create, because the world is inherently seeking to subjugate and oppress sex workers and certain populations of sex workers specifically. So when we think about the ways in which those identities play out, we want to talk about a couple of strategies specifically to help healing. So we acknowledge that these paradigms happen. We acknowledge that we enter into them at every level of human. At times we end up in emotionally or psychologically abusive dynamics. And there's no guilt or shame in it. There's no blame. There's a space for self-forgiveness first, and a space for acceptance around, I got into this, these are the reasons why, how do I move out of this dynamic? And one of the first strategies I want to suggest is what I call fucking the power paradigm. So every human interaction has a power dynamic, right? You're walking down the street, you see a stranger, you're immediately assessing their identities, who they are, who's in a position of power, how you might interact with that person. Even more so when it comes to workplace or a client or a partner, right? So fucking those paradigms starts with having people who are willing to acknowledge all their identities, right? Acknowledge when they are in a position of power, acknowledge their identities which might give them privilege. For example, really common experience is a older cis heterosexual white man who's a producer or who's running an organization. They're inherently in a power of position and class and race and gender and orientation. So they have a ton of power. And so our ability to then be assertive and set boundaries and be clear about our wants and needs, as well as to push back if they make a declaration, is much harder because of their position of power. So hypothetically, in that first interaction with that person, whoever this person is, talk about those dynamics of power, right? Talk about, I'm worried about the ways in which your additional power, these examples, might play into my ability to be assertive with boundaries and be really clear about my wants and needs and negotiate my well-being on the set, in these interactions, in this conversation. I know how incredibly hard this can be with bosses or with clients. And so I acknowledge that. And sometimes it's easier to start practicing this, acknowledging the power with friends and family and community first, because it's an opportunity to start getting to know what it feels like, to start talking about power in an explicit way. Those of you who are in BDSM or kink spaces have a lot of experience sometimes in what is it like to negotiate power consensually and fuck with it in a way that feels really safe. And that can be a great template for what is it like to then do that in every interaction as a human, every partnership, where we're talking about who's in a role of power, what does that look like? And how do we, even though power is being exerted, how do we do so in a way that's consensual and ethical? Second strategy is understanding the ways in which those paradigms of oppression, if you've been oppressed because of your age, your gender, your race, your identity, because of sex work, how have those attitudes, values, beliefs about who you are seeped into your understanding of yourself? And start unpacking, where have you taken on the oppressor's language, and where has it become an internalized voice within yourself? And begin to practice some strategies of self-love, changing those voices to empower yourself to believe I'm worthy of care and love and respect and safe treatment in my job, in my relationships, in my community, and begin to narrate, what is your mantra for yourself? What are your strategies for beginning to believe that you're worthy of love and care and respect in every dynamic of your life, and changing that narrative, changing that story in your body? Some of this starts with understanding of trauma, and there's another webinar on trauma, so I'm not going to go too much into detail, but it's really helpful to start to understand the ways in which we engage in some of the patterns because we have been socialized to do so and because we've been trained because of survival. And trauma plays out because we viscerally know in our bodies this is the strategy to survive. A little kid who's being beaten or chased or sexually assaulted learns to subjugate their identity, make their voice small, make themselves small, right, and hide. And this is often the response, and find a way to stay safe. So when those kinds of dynamics play out as an adult, our bodies have been trained. We've been trained to continue that pattern of subjugation. And I'm going to show another little chart that will help with that. So when we think about the ways in which trauma manifests, and I mean, this is going to be a really quick overview, so I can certainly do more conversations on this, and feel free to message me and we can talk more about it. But when you think about your nervous system, our nervous system is the thing that controls the regulation of our bodies. So your sympathetic nervous system responds to escalate, which is the fight or flight response when something's activated, which is the on response. And then your parasympathetic nervous system responds to turn off if we're needing to shut down or freeze, which are both survival-oriented responses. And parasympathetic is the dissociation stuck off setting. So we call this middle area between the two dotted lines the window of tolerance. And most humans kind of oscillate between just slight levels of escalation, right? A little bit of stress, then you calm down, a little bit of stress, calm down. But when you have a trauma-related response or traumatic events, and it happens repeatedly, what happens is our bodies begin to be stuck on or stuck off all the time, where we're consistently escalated. And stuck on looks like a lot of these symptoms: anxiety, panic, hypervigilance, restlessness, flooding, sleeplessness. And you can imagine it kind of like you're just always at, when you think about moving your hyperarousal from 0 to 60, you're just always at 60. Your system is always on, it's always activated. Versus some folks who are more like in a stuck off setting, which can look like depression, lethargy, disorientation, disconnection, dissociation, shutting down. Identifying what your typical strategies are is really helpful, because the more you understand how you fluctuate, it can be really helpful then to know when you get into that pattern. Because abusive people will play into these same dynamics. They'll know how to respond to your activation, and they know how to continue to perpetuate it because this helps them stay in control. When we're either stuck on or stuck off, we are unlikely to be assertive about our boundaries because we're just in survival space. It's only in this sort of normal or typical window of tolerance is our frontal lobe, which is the smart part of our brains, is it online to be engaging in more complex activities such as problem solving or relational activities. Otherwise, we're just in survival. And so we're not able to navigate really complex situations like asserting boundaries or pushing back on conflict or moving out of a situation that's unsafe. Understanding how your patterns play out can be really helpful in navigating how to move out of that pattern. And ideally, we want to move towards equality or equity in relationships. Equality may not always be possible, but having more equity, which is the space where someone is working harder to give you more access because of the ways in which you've been oppressed in the past, can be helpful. And this can look like respect and trust and building honesty, sharing responsibility. This is somewhat targeted towards a partnership, but can be the same in workplace or colleagues or clients too. And the last image I want to show you is this, which is the 4D model. And I like to talk about it in the sense that One of the ultimate goals of us addressing trauma patterns, of us addressing the ways in which people are abusive to us, is that we want to figure out how to be fully integrated humans. And I know this sounds super woo, but when you think about the ways in which all the parts of you play out, it's really helpful to imagine that this is considered spiritual, but can be meaning making. The parts of you that seek to connect and make disconnections in the world, that it should be online and it should have access. So when you're feeling really calm, when you're regulated, when you're moving out of that trauma pattern, you have more ability to think about, why am I here? What am I doing? How do I relate to the world? We have more space, more relaxation, more time to just be in the experience of being us, which I know sounds a little idealistic, but it's one of the pieces of the puzzle. Integrating as well with our minds, our thoughts, our body, our sensations, our heart, how it feels to be us. What are our emotions like every day? And when we can stop and imagine all these parts integrating and working together, we have some space to begin to notice what it feels like to be safe in our bodies. Because ideally, you become your own source of grounding, of integration, of being whole in you. And no matter how people are treating you outside of your own space, people in work, people in community, ultimately, you are your own anchor to well-being. Safety and wholeness exists within you, and that's something we get to have access to, no matter what people are doing to us around us, which is our power, right? That little voice inside of you, that little bit of you that gets to say, I get to decide who I am. I decide how I treat myself. I decide how people see me in the way that I respond to that. I decide what boundaries I set. I decide how I relate to my experience. I decide what story I tell myself about what's happened to me. And in doing so, you're building resiliency. You're building access to community who also sees you that way. When we treat ourselves with care and respect, when we honor our power, when we honor our voice, we call in other relationships that want to do that as well, because we're not standing for people that will treat us less. And it's a really liberating experience to begin to notice, what is it like when you believe that you are the badass that you are, when you honor that you are doing transformational work. Sex workers have been at the front lines of social change, of liberation of women's rights, of sexual reproductive rights, of voting rights, of coups in many, many generations of stories in our history. And sex workers have been on the cutting edge of human change and evolution and growth and progress and transformation. And we get to celebrate that. We get to celebrate the ways in which humans absolutely need access to free and expressive sexuality. And we've believed that, whether we do it ideologically or it's just a job, either way, you're involved in social change. You're involved in liberating sex and liberating pleasure and liberating humans from these constructs that have decided that this work is bad and that you are bad and that you get to be abused as a result. You deserve safe and healthy relationships and communities and workplaces and partnerships. And I'm excited to work with many of you. I'm going to end today so that we don't go on too much over our time, but overall, keeping in mind any type of coercion or control or manipulation is abusive behavior, and you don't have to take that. And we get to set a boundary. And to the extent that you can move out of those situations is ideal, and seeking support can really help, from community, from a therapist, online, lots of resources to get out of those dynamics and get to a safe space. And ultimately finding a safe space within inside yourself that you get to decide how you see yourself and what you deserve. Thanks so much for listening today, and I'm grateful that I get to do a lot of work with many of you and get to be a part of your community. You can find me at connectivesextherapy.com or healingintersections.com. Currently, I do in-person practice and video chats, as well as I do digital support groups with Raquel Savage and Jim and Nikki Board. So I'm so grateful that you're here, and I wish you well.